Great. Thank you, everyone, for coming in today for our next popular culture dialogue. Today, we will be discussing the relationship between popular culture and religion, which is interesting given that we were just talking about popular culture and folklore and how those relate. And I think of religion in similar ways, but that just might be because I'm not a religious person myself, so I might be missing something important there. But joining me today, we have several esteemed colleagues from across the pond. I believe we're United States and UK at the point. So I'm just going to let them introduce themselves and what brings them here today. And we're going to start down below me with Charlotte.
Ah. Hi, I'm Charlotte Naylor Davis. I'm an independent scholar at the moment. My original PhD thesis was on the Bible and translation. And then I started writing on metal, kind of in that moment where you finished your thesis and you can't bear to look at it. And so you write something else. So I started working on kind of the way the Bible is received in metal, and that's sort of taken off. So I tend to write at the moment and research on the Bible in subcultures, particularly how texts are translated into other media. So how does a text become a film, become song lyrics? How does the musicology affect the reception? And I'm really into reception studies. So what I'm interested in is, where does this stuff land? So it's great that Metallica, for example, use the Bible lyrics in a particular way, but that's only 4 people, but they have millions of hearers. So how does it land? What's that reception of the Bible in those places? Is my kind of bit of nerd. I've just published an article on Octavia Butler and science fiction and the invention of kind of futurology of scripture. So that's my other. I'm a nerd. I mean, I'm a nerd. When I'm an academic, I'm a Bible nerd. The rest of the time, I'm just a nerd.
Thank you for being here, Charlotte. And I might have to ask you about if you've heard, there's a Buddhist heavy metal band. I think it's actually might be a death metal band too, where they take Buddhist scripture and they're using metal to try to spread Buddhist scripture. Have you heard of that?
Amazing. Okay. I'll need to look them up because that's my jam.
I think they're out of Taiwan, if that helps. They even have a Buddhist nun who plays with them in their band.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll get into this because I think the reception of different religions is really interesting in popular culture. What's cool and what isn't. What's okay and what isn't.
Definitely. Well, thank you for being here. I'm going to go over next to your side then. We're going to go to Jake.
Well, yeah, thanks for having me here. I don't feel worthy of being in the presence of these esteemed scholars around me. I'm an independent scholar. I have a master's degree and will seek the PhD one of these days when that can become affordable and available and all those things. Yeah, I do a lot of work with Christians specifically, and on that end, helping them to kind of think about how to create art that is good art and that is faithful to the Christian tradition. My background is more in Bible. That's what my Master of Theological Study has, that scripture focus. But I kind of I've kind of decided to sort of exit the biblical scholarship and explore more of the fun theology kind of thing. But of course, I like that intersection. And a lot of my work is about in sort of how the Bible is communicated, especially particularly with humor. My latest research interest is communicating faith with humor, especially looking at like the ethics of Christian satire. Of course, the Babylon Bee is kind of the big name in that space. People have various opinions about those, and I have opinions about that publication. But that's a lot of my research and interests is in that kind of space, and I want to not just research that, but also create things that are uniquely Christian, but that are good art and storytelling. So I have a podcast, and I also write fiction and do things like that. So, yeah.
I'm all for the creative academic approaches and trying to, make sure that we're not just talking to other academics, hence
Right.
these dialogues here too.
Yeah.
I have a friend up in, I think he's still in Minnesota, working for a church where he produces like videos for them, like short movies, short films, and very creative stuff, even kind of some sci-fi stuff, which is interesting as well. So there's definitely all of that going on, which is really interesting for that connection between popular culture and religion. Wonderful.
What's your podcast called, Jake?
I have a podcast called The Bible But Funnier, and that's just that's a humorous retelling of the Bible stories. And I think the Bible is a lot funnier than we give it credit for. So I like to bring that out and then add some fun stuff in there.
Cool. Well, my original thesis, my thesis title is it faithful? ? So that's so I like your use of the word faithful there, because it's a great debate. What is faithful in a retelling, in a thing? It's fun.
Thank you for being here, Jake. And it's not about, bowing down or anything. We're all equals because we're all interested in this topic. That's how we approach it. And we'll go to George.
Hi. Well, I'm actually glad Charlotte and Jake went first, because it gave me some more ideas what to share here. But my name is George Tsakiridis. I'm a senior lecturer in philosophy and religion at South Dakota State University. And my background actually is in religion and science. So my PhD was with the Zygon Center at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. So I did religion and science work. So my work's always been interdisciplinary. And just in recent years, I've kind of just given myself permission to go ahead and dive into pop culture and religion, because it's kind of like taboo. Like some people don't, want like, oh, that's not real scholarship. And it's like, obviously it is. And so I just gave myself permission. And Matthew Brake he's a series editor for the Theology and Pop Culture series with Lexington Fortress. So I have 3 projects with them. Just finishing editing Theology and Spider-Man. I'm working with a colleague, David Gooden, on Theology and Breaking Bad. And then I'm doing a monograph on Theology and the Americans about the Soviet sleeper spies, which is just, I love that show. And so it's just fun. And it really gives you a chance to, integrate scholarship with what people are talking about and enjoy. And so I've really enjoyed doing that and making a lot of progress with those projects. I'm also kind of on the side, I'm an actor and filmmaker, so I do some creative work. So actually, Jake, I'm glad to hear you mention those things. And I have a podcast also with a friend, Randy Woodbury. It's Cheers Weekly. So we go episode up by episode, the Cheers television show. So, and we're in almost done with season 7, and there were 275 episodes, and it's a long haul. But so I'm working on a few creative projects also with that, and just doing a lot of stuff, and it's fun to be here, and I'm really glad you set this up.
Well, I'm glad you gave yourself permission, and I'm sorry to hear that there's still that reluctance. Is it more reluctance among like theological religious scholars?
I think not necessarily. I think it's just there are groups that like, well, you're not really doing real scholarship because you're having fun. I don't know. Yeah. I think that's part of it. I think there's I shouldn't say this on a recording, but there's like a little jealousy that you're doing something that's enjoyable. And, people want to go, well, you should be digging into this other stuff. But popular culture is the way people understand the world in large part. And so why wouldn't we apply our academic expertise to that field?
Yeah. I mean, I'm fully kind of in the world of biblical studies, and although reception studies is kind of like garnering kind of it's becoming much bigger, there's still a feeling that kind of like the real thing is when you parse verbs in immense detail on a Bible text. And I also think it's partly kind of the annexing of theology and biblical studies, because they've very much ended up in kind of like religious institutions or in training colleges or seminaries or whatever. And the problem with that is it doesn't open it up to interdisciplinary work in the way that, say, being in an English literature department does. So Sheffield Interdisciplinary Biblical Studies group are in an English literature department. So they, by definition, do interdisciplinary work, but most people I know working on kind of the Bible and pop culture, there's a real problem getting people to do good interdisciplinary stuff that actually uses disciplines outside. So they do biblical studies on a popular culture text, in inverted commas, whether that's a film or whatever. But they're essentially using biblical studies methodology. And there's not as much engagement or just training on the kind of cultural studies method. And so you don't get that kind of pairing, you just get sort of like an outward view. And they do that, and then and that was the criticism that I met when I first went to metal studies, was people going, this is really good, but you need to talk to a musicologist if you're going to talk about music. Like, you need to talk, like, why are you need to talk to a filmmaker if you're going to talk about film. You need to, like, this is how this works. And I think there's a bit of that. They also talk about have you come across the term fan academia, like fan studies?
Yeah.
So
Oh,
people constantly kind of go, you're just doing it because you're a fan, which I always think, coming from theologians, is the funniest thing. Because if ever there were a realm of fan studies, it's Christian theology. Like, why are you writing this? Because you love God, right? So so I can write on Star Trek if you can write about Jesus, is always my life.
I've wanted to do just one thing quick, George. I've wanted to do a documentary called Fans of Christ for the longest time at this point, and I'm not sure if working at a Catholic liberal arts university is the best place to do it from, but I really love this way of looking at religion as a fandom. So I'm glad you brought that up. I'm sorry, George.
No, that's fine. That's the nature of Zoom too. One thing, I kind of hate that though. It's like people will critique because you enjoy something and you want to, I mean, like, passion for something is what drives us to do better scholarship also, I think. So I don't totally get that. And one of my approaches to popular culture, study is to kind of do it, I don't want to say as a fan, but, from within, how it does affect us emotionally, how it does move us, because that's a major element of it. And if you kind of compartmentalize too much, which I think a lot of people do, then you're losing something.
Yeah, I don't know if this is maybe more prevalent in religious studies, theology, biblical studies, and so forth, but it seems that academia has that long tradition of, we want logical, we want rational, that whole affective, illogical stuff. No. That's not what a scholar is. And I think we're seeing a lot more pushback and a lot more understanding of the importance of the affective and the emotional and so on and so forth, but we're not there yet.
No.
That's one of the reasons I'm a big fan of William James, and because he brought that affective element into philosophy. Although there's some different opinions on his work, I'm sure. But
sorry, Charlotte.
No, sorry, good.
Well, I'm going to ask a question that might be a good place to jump off of with the three of you, given what we've just been talking about. And I don't know if this will be a controversial question or not, but I love controversy. Is religion a pop culture or a popular culture?
I feel like we just dove into the deep end really quick.
I mean, I can go first again if you want. I'm always
Go for it.
I would say aspects are popular culture. So, I mean, looking from where I'm at, like in the UK, our view of American evangelicalism, for example, there are huge chunks that are popular culture. I mean, in some that they are fan created. I mean, like, the Christian contemporary music scene is absolutely popular culture, I would say. It's as much a scene as, like, the metal scene is or the goth scene is, and hip hop and stuff. Because when I think of goth and hip hop, for example, metal's a bit different. they are both scenes which involve not only music, but certain attitudes, bits of writing, literature, poetry, art, style, aesthetics. And the Christian contemporary music scene has a whole bunch of other stuff that comes with being a fan of it, right? A whole bunch of like attitude to life, kind of, I guess there's bits of moral culture in there as well. But I would see that as a popular culture movement, but it is also religious. And so, I mean, is religion popular culture? We'd have to define religion, which is maybe a bigger discussion than today. But, but are there aspects of religious practice that are popular culture more than they are linked to the kind of doctrines or tenet of religion? I would say definitely so, without a doubt.
Yeah, I think I would agree with most of what you said, Charlotte, that like religion, I mean, to do religious studies is in a sense to do cultural studies.
Yeah.
And so religion and culture have a ton of overlap. And I do think within religious traditions, there are subcultures that are definitely driven by or even creating popular culture. And you mentioned contemporary Christian music. That's a great example in the US. And I mean, growing up in the 80s and graduating high school in the early 90s, that was a huge part of kind of that subculture. I mean, it's changed over time, but it was, and you know, there's a lot of in-group, out-group dynamics with that. Like you have to be, you know, in the in-group to be properly a part of that culture and to experience and enjoy that culture. And I think that American evangelicalism uses pop culture as its main kind of modus operandi of, you know, how they share their message, that it adapts to culture as it moves. And you can see this throughout the 20th century. I have a piece that's in review right now with a volume on evangelicalism and technology and populism. And it's so like radio, television, you know, even starting with like pamphlets, you know, 200 years ago, whatever the modern technology for sharing a message is, evangelicals are kind of first on the scene often. And so I think certain religious groups are driven by popular culture more than others. I think I would answer the question that way.
Kind of in their name, right? Evangelical.
Yeah, I'll just echo a lot of what was already said. But yeah, my first thought was sort of this idea of religion, specifically evangelical Christians, kind of copying aspects of culture and sort of, you know, making it their own, or there's their own kind of music or their own kind of movies. So in that way, it's sort of because it's kind of a copy. I guess it depends on sort of how you define pop culture. If it's so kind of reductive like that, does that mean it's not its own culture? But I would still probably lean towards, there's kind of aspects of religion as pop culture for a lot of the same reasons. You know, there's that insider-outsider kind of divide. But the interesting thing that I explore a lot is sort of how that's done, and also sort of this push to get what is religious subculture into the mainstream. We've seen that a lot with Christian movies lately, where there was a time when cinema, it was all sort of kind of Christian. It just kind of naturally was religious. And then it became not explicitly religious. And now there's sort of these big movie studios are taking chances on these big Christian movies. So it's kind of interesting to see in where this particular kind of culture is trying to bleed out and trying to become the dominant culture. So I think with specifically evangelical Christianity, I think while they probably wouldn't use the term popular culture, I think they conceive of themselves as a kind of culture, and they're specifically wanting to become the dominant culture in these different areas.
And that's an interesting thought too. Sorry, go ahead, Charlotte.
Well, I think that there is something interesting about, and obviously we are talking, I think, you know, we're three of us mainly talking about Christianity, and aware that there's lots of other religions that probably function differently with pop culture. I think there's something quite interesting about, ideas of mission, and when it comes to kind of particularly Christianity and like Protestant Christianity and how that works as populating, like you say, populating or colonizing popular culture and other cultures. So like you have your own Christian culture, which is a definite thing. I mean, I can make distinct markers in my life between those people that I would mention some things to and other people who would not get the joke, and it's because they're my in-culture group, and these guys really would not get it. But there's also there's a colonizing aspect of using pop culture to, but also trying to infect it. So in metal studies, there's a big discussion about how religion plays. I'm trying to write a book on the Bible and metal. But one of the interesting things is how people are received when they come from Christianity into metal, and what authenticity is in both those aspects. And you can lose your authenticity as a Christian by moving over into metal, but you can also lose your metal authenticity by being Christian, or you've got to kind of prove your authenticity. And I think that kind of is interesting about how those boundaries, those like liminal spaces, I guess, between religious and pop culture, and whether it's being used or whether it is actually part of it, is interesting for me, that kind of colonization.
And I think there's like, with looking at different religious traditions, the kind of dogmatics or doctrinal beliefs of different religious traditions are going to drive how they, accept pop culture. So like Islamic views of art are much different than, let's say Roman Catholic Christian, which are different than Protestant Christian, which are different than, Judaism. So like that really drives what is possible, I think, in the popular culture, arena also, because of what images can be shown and how, actually also ethics and morality of kind of the traditions.
Yeah, images is interesting. So in kind of some of the black metal bands in kind of Iranian black metal, even though they're talking about they will use images of Satan, and they'll use inverted crosses, even though an inverted cross really means nothing in their culture. But it's such a predominant image from elsewhere of being rebellious that they can import it, and yet actually as a religious symbol it's not remotely doing what that image does when you have an inverted cross in the States, or in Italy, for example, where like there's like black metal bands there. And that's that kind of cross-cultural religious symbols still mean something, even if they're completely out of their context, if you start to kind of invert them or oppose them. And yeah, there's something quite interesting, like you say, about that culturally, whether it even works for you to engage in pop culture. I mean, the Christian phrase of "in the world but not of it" like is a really interesting little how people walk that line of being in but not of, and what is acceptable in different Christian kind of cultures, how far gone you are. Like, whether you're considered to be too worldly or not worldly. It is something I came up against a lot in my teens.
Yeah, well, I think that drove the whole contemporary Christian music scene, especially like in the 80s and 90s, because it was like, we need to kind of sanctify this popular culture mode of art and then separate it. So like, we can do this, but we can do it within our subculture versus, accepting the broader popular culture on those themes, even though it may be very religious in many cases.
Yeah. I think that's quite interesting as well, because at that point you're talking about where the meaning of the thing resides. And again, in music studies, we would talk about like whether the meaning is in lyrics or it's in the music or a combination of those two things. But contemporary Christian music definitely, when it's okay, it's kind of the lyrics. You can listen to rap if it's Christian rap. You can listen to metal if it's Christian. It was just the lyrics, They decided it was the words, which I think again is an interesting study to be done somewhere about kind of how important that logocentric nature of kind of late 20th century religion is. Text is everything, and as long as your words are correct, we can the rest of it's malleable, at least, you know.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I think that's where it's gone and historically has been. But I remember as a child in the 80s, like there was this period where within at least evangelical Protestant Christianity, there was this fear of new age music. And it was like the music itself was opening you up to demonic paths and those sorts of, and of course there was this whole thing in the coming out of the 70s where people were burning albums, you know, that were, you know, like rock and roll music. And
I've been at a CD smashing.
Like, that actually the music itself was evil in some way, but then that kind of went away and it just became, you know, as you said, word centric.
Yeah.
It's as Charlotte just mentioned, there was CD smashing. I think of the Satanic Panic in relationship to D&D. Yeah. There's been, I mean, Harry Potter is a good recent example too of that type of panic as well. But it is interesting to think about how you're almost describing this policing of what is and what isn't religious, and thus what is and isn't okay, which is something, you know, we see in politics and we see in fandom circles and everything like that too. And who gets to decide what is and isn't correct is also an interesting thing to wrestle with.
Yeah.
In fandom, we talk about like big name fans and BNFs and things like that, and how in a sense, I guess then for at least Roman Catholics, I guess the Pope is a BNF because no one's bigger than the Pope when it comes to doctrinal importance and interpretation.
Yeah, I think gatekeeping is really fascinating, and I mean, you can't separate off some of that stuff from the sort of 70s, 80s, and 90s. I think you have to talk about race when it comes to that. And I mean, the Jesus and John Wayne book, which if anyone's read, I mean, is incredibly worth reading. But there's a bunch of kind of work coming out deconstructing that sort of white supremacist stuff within Christianity. But part of that definitely showed, and I totally didn't register at the time because I was like 12, 15, but you know, if you're going to say that drums and repetitive rhythms are satanic, then there's a heck of a lot of a kind of white supremacist leaning in there, and a Eurocentric idea of what is good and holy versus what is outside or rebellious or free or kind of, and that's quite interesting. And you can't get away from the race gatekeepers, even if they didn't necessarily know that that was how they were doing it. That's definitely going to be part of it, I think, at least in the mid 20th century. Good.
Jake, you look like you have something to jump in with here because we're talking about music and everything.
Well, yeah, music is not my field, definitely. I don't know. I was just kind of I was thinking a lot about this. I posed a question on Twitter a while ago on my company's Twitter page that just asked, like, what is Christian fiction? Is it a genre? Is it a market? What is it? And that was hotly debated because there are some aspects of which, you know, if you're going to make a Christian movie, what you're really probably thinking of is a market. You're thinking of, you know, moms in their 40s who probably have a van load of kids. Like, you know, there's a demographic kind of element to that. But then there also is sort of some kind of genre things you're ticking off if you're going to create something, you know, that's Christian movie, Christian book. You know, there's a, I don't know, it's a very interesting kind of dynamic what makes something, like we were talking about gatekeeping. I was thinking of the Martin Scorsese movie Silence, which I really enjoy, about these Catholic missionaries that go to Japan. And see, that's one that has, you know, you can tick off the boxes of a lot of like Christian themes and elements. But it's not a movie that the church groups went to go see at the theaters together. It wasn't counted as a Christian movie, probably for a couple of reasons. One, I think what also makes it good is it kind of not everybody is happy and saved at the end. There's sort of an ambiguity to the ending, so it probably doesn't, get into the Christian market that way.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting how even things that have so many of those boxes checked as Christian don't count in the subculture.
With the responses that you got, were most of them, if it's Christian, it has to have the X, Y, and Z, or were they, it can't have X, Y, and Z? Like, is there a not list as well as a positive? Like, is there it can do these things, but it can't go this far, right? So, like, because in literature, the debate about Harry Potter was always fun, because people would go, well, it's not okay because it's got wizards, and you'd go like, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and they go, yeah, but it's because it's connected to this realm, and it'll make people think they want to be wizards. And again, you'd go, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, like they so but there was like some sort of line where it was like, well, this goes too far, but it can have this much magic, but not. So did people come back with a positive and a negative?
Yeah, I think there is kind of a positive and negative. At the end of the day, though, I think for it to count, it has to have like a very specific intention.
Okay.
I think the message is really one of the most important things. So, I mean, C.S. Lewis writing the Chronicles of Narnia, he's trying to communicate that, although if you actually read some of his stuff, he actually tries to say, no, it's kind of a coincidence. He's not actually Jesus. It's just kind of related anyway. But I forgot what term he uses, but it's just like, well, it's a what if scenario. What if Jesus was, in this other world? So it's not really Jesus, but I digress. So yeah, in some cases it has to be doing this. So, silence, just to use that example again, is not trying to convert somebody or give somebody that religious feelings. Just telling a story, and it has these kind of themes in the background. So it doesn't count. But I've had so many debates on like, can a Christian movie have cussing or something? Or can we actually show like, in the real world, people cuss and they have sex and stuff? Like that's what happens. But these movies don't want to show that. And so there's tons of debate. Like, well, you can, there are ways to not, to allude to that, but not really show it. And, the foghorn, every time somebody tries to cuss, I don't know. So there is definitely a don't list, but I find more it has to be doing this, which is different than, the latest Marvel movie comes out. I'm not saying there aren't like agendas, but they're not really true. At the end of the day, their goal isn't, I want you to sign up for this group. And it's that sort of message-driven, agenda-driven thing that seems to set the Christian subculture apart. Even if, that latest Chris Tomlin song on the radio isn't trying to like convert you to Christianity, it wants you to do something. It's very explicitly trying to get you to do something.
Yeah. That's so interesting because one of the things with the Christian metal debate and the kind of authenticity thing is people are really happy in subcultures generally. So this is the same in kind of goth, and I would say in things like comics even. I mean, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but like my what's happened, what I see and in the research I've done, you can be accepted as a Christian, whatever it is, if those two things kind of grew up together. But if you're trying to colonize this thing with Christianity, then you're not allowed. So the Christian black metal bands or white metal bands or whatever they are, one of the problems, there's a couple that are really well loved and really well represent, like everybody adores them, but they make it very explicit that they are not missional, like they are not trying to proselytize, they just are metalers who love Jesus, and therefore these two things come out of them in this expression of this album. But there are ones who've made it very explicit that their purpose is to change the nature of metal to be Christian and to bring people to Christ. and they're really rejected because there's a rejection of that colonization or missional kind of activity, and people don't want to be, and they feel it's inauthentic because they feel like someone is using metal as a tool for Christianity rather than it being expressed from them. And the goth stuff has been the same. There's some really popular goth bands that are Christian and goth kind of artists and various designers, but the ones who are missional or from the other side colonizers are really rejected. And that's quite that intention thing is interesting then, because I think one of the reasons the Christian bands, at least the metal bands, particularly in like the 90s, that would go to, there's a big Christian metal event in the States, and I can't remember, my husband took his band there, but you would get a lot of money. You could get a church to pay for you, right, to come and tour the States if you said that your intention was to tell people about Jesus. But if you were coming just to play metal, you couldn't. So there was like interesting incentives between
where
you place yourself.
Oh, and financial incentives honestly play a huge role in all of this stuff. But maybe a different topic.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting though too, because that was just helping me think about something regarding QAnon. So I like that idea of that line between, the mission work and, it just happens to be who I am. And I'm just expressing who I am kind of work, which is interesting. Maybe to flip this argument then, are there popular cultures out there that are essentially acting as religions? Because I know I've already pointed, before we started recording, I pointed to my Star Wars and, how the Jedi Order in some accounts is considered a religion. So what happens there?
You paused halfway through your sentence. We lost part of you.
Yeah.
Well,
you paused very dramatically with your hand on your chest, though. So we lost part of what you said.
Well,
repeating what you said.
It was probably someone up above me saying, "Oh, no, don't say those things." But like when you have situations like Star Wars, or I know The Big Lebowski is another one that's been brought up like this. What happens when we start looking at popular cultures and fandoms as religions?
Yeah, I think you kind of can. So a friend of mine, this is totally anecdotal. I know I'm talking a lot. Sorry, I'll stop a minute. So a friend of mine ages ago, his girlfriend made a joke that board gaming was his religion. And he texted me and said, she keeps getting at me about how board gaming is my religion, but you're my religion, Scott. Like, tell her that's clearly not the case. And then I was like, well, the thing is, you gather like every week with the same group of people around a table to do these things. And you have this ritual where one of you reads out the rules and explains them to the other people. And the rules are absolute. I mean, like they are absolute. They were playing Pandemic Legacy at the time, which I don't know if you know, is a game you can only play once. So you have to play it with the same people over a long period of time. You can only play it once it's played, it's played. But the rules are absolute. Like, you can't go. So I was like, so you have tenets and you have like ideas. And then I said, also, you do proselytize. And he was like, no, we don't. I was like, you do. When I moved up here to Leeds, you were like, I know you're not really into board games, but we've got some like easier ones that you can play. And he said to me, you can come round and have dinner, and then we'll just play one of these games. And I was like, that's an alpha course. You're inviting me round for dinner to have a brief like chat and play some easy games, and I can opt out if I want. And then we realized that, of course, LARPing, so live action role play, like these guys are the mystics of the board game culture. They go off into a field and they fully embody the game. They live the game for 42 hours. So I was like, yeah, I think board gaming it has a lot of aspects, at least, of ritual. If religion is what you do, not what you believe, as the Keeping It 101 guys say, if religion is what you do, then ritual boundary markers, group identity, kind of small communities, but with bigger covering kind of like bigger communities, conventions, things like that, then there are aspects of the ritual and the kind of the community that are religious.
Yeah, I think I mean, it can be seen as a religion, I think, but then we're kind of going back to the question you mentioned early on, Carrie Lynn, the, folklore versus religion and just cultural studies. And I think so, like, it depends on how you define religion. If it is kind of a type of culture or a type of creating folklore, then I think all of this does fit into it. If you separate religion and say you need to have like these markers of, a deity or some kind of a specific doctrinal organization, although like you're saying, Charlotte, I think there is some doctrinal organization there probably. But I mean, I think it depends on how the individual, embraces it too, because there are things we do in everyday life that are, kind of cultural habits that could be seen in the same way that we would say are not religion. So that's why I'm kind of on the fence, adopting that fully. And maybe you are too. Yeah. But
yeah, it just was amusing because the more I looked into it, the more his gaming became religious. Yeah. Like the more we pushed it, the funnier it became.
And I think it's funny sometimes doing like that kind of humorous exercise of engaging it, you actually find, well, actually, maybe this is a religion, or this is what you are kind of, having fun with. But I mean, like, I think just religion and philosophy in general kind of deal with meaning in our lives and those sorts of things. So if gaming becomes your central meaning in life and your rituals are, kind of spread out from there, maybe it would be your religion. I think though, like to the Jedis or Star Wars or something, you could make maybe even more of a case because there are mystical elements. And so things that are, like the myth of Star Wars then takes on a real kind of seated meaning in people's lives, where they actually adopt that mystical meaning and move from there. I mean, but like, yeah, this is fun to kind of explore this, but I think, Star Wars, it was what, 1977 is the first one, I think. So like, in the 70s and 80s, I don't think you'd have that. But as it started to grow over time, it takes on a mythology that is beyond, so if you look at Star Wars 100 years from now, maybe it is a religious tradition of some sort, because that mythology keeps growing and it becomes seated in people's kind of hearts and minds.
Yeah, Disney will probably still be milking it for money in 100 years. So
yeah, it's not going anywhere now. It's established. You couldn't get more established pop culture than being bought by Disney, right? Like,
that's true.
And I think that like this jumps back to I think Charlotte, you were saying earlier, but you're implicitly talking about canon. Like what is
Canon's
so like this is an issue of canon too, especially like in the Star Wars universe, in Marvel universe, whatever, they're like, what's canon and what's not canon? And so when you start to talk about that, the texts themselves as films or as comic books or whatever, then take on this other larger conversation. And that becomes I think that is religion, or at least you can do religious studies with that.
So Tom Doberenz has written about fanfic and stuff, and there's a bunch of people now looking at kind of like apocrypha as fan fiction. So like, because I mean, like the Nag Hammadi texts are 200 years or like at least 150 years after the Gospels are written, right? But they are extra Gospels and they pull on different ideas, and so people are using the fanfic kind of methodology to talk about like that. What is it to be in a community that is living and playing with these ideas and maybe not living by them, but they're the narratives that you use to frame your world, aren't they? And like any fandom is that. Even if you're not living by it, for example, in the way that you do with the doctrine, they are still the stories you use with each other to express yourselves and to understand your world. And so people are looking at like how that can help us understand the ancient world before there's a canon, before Nicaea, before Chalcedon. The canon isn't set, but people are retelling these stories, passing them around, doing it verbally, you know, to different communities. And it's a really fun bit of scholarship at the moment, but it's also really very serious, because yeah, this is the way that you process, it's the way you develop your religious traditions. I mean, very quickly people were using like the Harry Potter houses. It was just shorthand to describe yourself. It's much easier to just say I'm a Ravenclaw. And like everybody knows what you mean, then you're done, right? Like you can now get on with being friends, because you've parsed it with your story from outside.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, that's folklore, and it's folklore, it's narrative, it's religion.
Yeah, and I think actually what we're doing in like religion and pop culture study is kind of a Talmudic approach to that canon. Then is that we're creating interpretations of the canon that then get read and can or cannot become authoritative.
Yeah.
And so there is kind of this tradition that we see in Judaism, you know, of that development, and I think that's part of what we're doing. And I had no plans of saying that sentence when I started this, but that's kind of, I think, how this is developing, and I think that's what it looks like, you know.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think in maybe some ways that the problem with that sort of religion and pop culture studies often has is that Christianity, at least, and particularly kind of what is now considered mainstream Christianity, is quite restrictive in the way it deals with canon, but other religions are not. So yeah, we've got Talmudic stuff, we've got Midrash, and inside of inside of Islam, which people think of as being very constrictive, you still have the Hadith, and you have these discussions about, well, okay, this is what the text says, but here's these other things that are semi-authority, a part of the discussion of authority. And that definitely fits with the way that pop culture, I mean, at least in the nerd cultures I'm in, is used, you know. And particularly to give you, thinking about it, that point at which you're not quite sure if it's authoritative or not, but they feel like your people. You haven't quite, you know, are they really one of us? Well, they feel like us. They've got a couple of the elements. We'll let them in for now, without it having to assent to a set of qualifying statements, but you're on the edge and you're part of the thing because, you know, we'll let you in. You've gone to one Comic-Con. You didn't dress up, but you did go. So
that's like that policing and gatekeeping and the
Yeah.
inclusion versus exclusion aspect again too. I mean, what counts as being part of my religion, or who do I see as then being outside of my religion? So yeah.
And that's why, like, within pop culture studies and religion and pop culture specifically, like, I think it's important to look at how it affects us and how it isn't just the text itself and what, you know, like the authorial intent, but it's, you know, kind of this, I don't want to sound too philosophical there, but like, you know, Recurian, you know, like engagement, and that we are moved by it and it changes us. And like gatekeepers sometimes try and keep that out of the conversation and say, well, no, that's not what pop culture studies are about. And it's like, well, I think it is. We have to invite all of that so we get a fuller picture of how we understand these texts. And I use texts loosely, of course.
I think one of the things that might be an interesting way to think about religion and popular culture here, just by listening to everyone talk, is that it seems religious studies have been focused primarily on those texts and on the meaning in them, and trying to decipher and trying to, you know, make sense of what the texts are saying. And I'm coming from this from a pop culture studies perspective, so tell me if I'm wrong. But in popular culture, it's that popular part that comes in, because that then gets you back to the public, just like in folklore, it's the folk part that gets you back to the people. So it almost seems that with popular culture, yeah, we study the texts, but we study texts to understand what they're saying about the people and what the people are doing with all of this and how the people are trying to make sense of things. So it's still really trying to focus on what people think and feel and do, versus I think religious studies has that tradition of more, what does the doctrine say? What are these tenets? What are those main foundational canonical things, and just trying to really understand the canon.
I think that's certainly true for theology and biblical studies. Religious studies is a little wider, but and more sociological. But the mainstream study of theology, which is where that has all sat for a long time, particularly with Christianity, does that. What's weird for me about reception studies that's important is that actually, as far as Christianity is concerned, for most of the church's history, most people couldn't read the text. So for most of the church's history, they were absolutely imbibing the text via art, folk song, stories they told one another. Like that's how you would do it. If you go to, in Europe, you can just happen upon like random churches. So I found one in France that was a 12th century church that they've recently like taken some plaster off and found these wall paintings from the 12th century. And the wall paintings told the story of the gospel. So they started with hell they started with creation on the left-hand side at the back, Christ in glory at the altar, and then hell over here on the other side. So it was a narrative, because the service would be done in Latin by a priest who was facing away from you, reading from a Latin Bible. You're not hearing any of that. Where are you getting your knowledge of God from? The paintings on the wall and the story that's around, that's what you're doing. And it's where folklore kind of comes into it. And even music, Charles Wesley's hymns are all written to tunes of pub drinking songs, because you've got to get people to memorize scripture. And the only way to do that is to give them something that they can remember. So actually, I think it's one of the reasons why reception studies of the Bible particularly is becoming more popular, because it's that realization that actually the way most people, when you read the Bible and you think, how did people get it so wrong? Like clearly Jesus is giving or telling people to give their money away. Well, if you only saw the Jesus of Nazareth film, that bit isn't in it. That's why. So, and coming back to film, like Cecil B. DeMille is a bit of an obsession of mine. But for many, many people, it is impossible to read the Exodus story without imagining Charlton Heston as Moses. But Charlton Heston's Moses, DeMille's Moses, is a post-war kind of American, kind of hero. And DeMille writes him specifically to be that. Moses in the text doesn't like talking aloud. Aaron has to go with him because he's too nervous. Well, Charlton Heston is 1950s masculinity, like the epitome of it, right? But that is absolutely the lens that you then read the text through. Like, for my dad, that's the story of the Exodus. He doesn't read his Bible. He's not a Christian. So what does he know of the text? That. And the question is whether, therefore, that is the text. If that's the only text you know, is that what the Bible is? So yeah, like I think it's fun that popular culture studies is coming in new, but really it's actually how people imbibe their religion for most of Christianity. This obsession with reading the book itself is very new.
And it is like, Charlotte, you're mentioning like Charles Wesley, the hymns. That's another form of like kind of trying to sanctify the culture to make it Christian so that people can engage it. And we can maybe take that further back to the Renaissance and before with just the art forms of the day and such. And it gets kind of twisted up in a way that's hard to untangle, I think. Yeah. But yeah, the culture is driving the meaning amongst the people then.
Yeah.
And still is, as you're saying, I think.
I'd love to hear a little from Jake about who gets to be involved in Christian art making, because I think one of the things that's interesting is that historically, so Michelangelo one of our greatest Christian artists ever. I mean, we're pretty sure he's at least queer, right? and that is accepted as some of the greatest Christian art. But I wonder if he'd be allowed to make Christian art in certain circles now. And that kind of gatekeeping of the moral qualities and kind of the artist is interesting in religious kind of art, and whether it's acceptable as Christian or not, depending on who made it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, Christian art is mostly created by very conservative, not just evangelicals, because I'm connected with a lot of Catholic artists. There's a whole like Catholic comic book industry and all that kind of stuff. But it's generally very conservative people. I think that's partially because they're the ones that feel a need to create in that subculture.
Yeah.
More, and when I say conservative and liberal, I mean, I don't really like those terms, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So the more, the liberal Christians, whatever, they're more like, well, I'm okay with creating in this more public space, wrestling with these questions. So that's where they're going. So it's hard to tell what's gatekeeping and what's just naturally, those more liberal-minded people don't want to be in this explicit Christian art space. But maybe that's because it's very restricting, and yeah, I guess.
Or maybe because they're not allowed in the other space.
Well, yeah,
I mean,
sure.
That again, gatekeeping works both ways, right?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting how many specifically Christian creatives are concerned with being canceled. And I'm like, you have 5 followers on Twitter. You're probably fine. But but there's that concern of being canceled, right? Like, I have to create in this space because the wider world doesn't accept me. If I say, if I say XYZ, then they won't like that. So I have to exist here. But there's also there's a tension because a lot of these creatives that I'm working with want to use it as evangelism. They want to be in the public, but they don't feel like they can speak their truth in the public. So what ends up happening is, well, it's the public that's the enemy. They're both the enemy and something that needs to be reformed, which can't really be done. I feel like you can't really you can't take it and change it if it's the enemy. So what often happens is there's kind of trying to replace it. Let's just throw it out. Let's do something different. In terms of like, moral qualifications for if you're creating, I'd have to think about that more. There's certainly Christianity has not, it has still allowed artists to create with certain kinds of like misogyny or various sex scandals. That seems to be okay in some circles, or at least not believed. Whereas other things, Christian artists, Christian musicians are really interesting. It seems like a lot of them recently have been like. Think evolution's true, and then it's like, what? And so that's interesting. Like, well, he believes in evolution, so can we listen to his music? Is a strange question asked, but that's a question that's being asked. So it seems to be more about beliefs than actually actions in some cases.
I think that's a very current popular culture. It's definitely, say, in metal, for example, with National Socialist black metal, the conversation of, can we listen to their music if we don't agree with their politics, or if we don't agree with their kind of content? Like, how do we separate that off, and what's the line? Is a very current debate in like, say, at least in metal, because exactly the sort of same thing, which is, they've made this awful Nazi statement. Do I now have to throw away my albums, my previous albums? Is it retroactive? Do we, like, how far back does it go? Can it be redeemed? It's a parallel parallel discussion, I think. I mean, that is partly the cancelling question anyway, isn't it? Is like, how much do you cancel somebody? It's very live in Harry Potter circles. What do you do with J.K. Rowling's statements about trans people? And what do you do with that? Do you never read them again? And I mean, we're back to what the text is, right? Is the text bigger than the author? Is it now? Has it got its life of its own? Can we pretend it appeared from nowhere? And yeah, how much is that? How much is that thing connected to its origins or its author or its original culture, which is absolutely at the crux of kind of religion and pop culture interactions, I think.
George, I know you've got something to pop in with.
I wanted to jump on what Jake said before we move on. And this is all good. But I think that's where like some aspects of American Christianity have gone really wrong. So you have a subgroup that wants to influence the culture by creating a parallel version of the art of the culture, but it's kind of a shadow of that art. It's not as good in general.
Amen.
And so
yes.
You're competing with the best with a message that is, so you're trying to convert those people with subpar content. You know, that's not gonna go anywhere. You can't attract people in this good content with subpar content and then make them accept your message. But that's been like kind of the mode of evangelism for many Protestant Christians in the last 40 years. Like, we're gonna make Christian music and then people will like that and then they're gonna come over here. Or, you know, our church services will be contemporary, but it's really kind of I'm gonna get in trouble.
Nope.
You know, a lame version of, you know, what is actually going on in popular music. So if someone's coming just for the music, they're not going to come to watch kind of, you know, shadow version of the real thing.
Right.
And I think that's like the underlying philosophy that's flawed in a lot of evangelical Christianity over the past 30, 40, 50, however many years.
Yeah.
And that's
Totally.
that plays out in a lot of different ways, and we've touched on it. But you know what you're saying, Jake, I think that's where I struggle with that, because the whole philosophical endeavor is flawed. And so I think as scholars, we can look at that and then kind of critique that and pull these things out. But I think within the subculture, there's a huge blind spot to that.
Well, and I think
used
on
to get
that,
sent. Sorry,
go on. Just quick, Charlotte, because we have to wrap this one up.
I used to get people used to send me tapes. So this was like the 80s and 90s, and I was clearly into like metal and stuff, and people would be like, this has got guitars, maybe listen to this instead. And it was like, this is like a really lame version of this Nirvana song. Like, why have you sent me this? Like, come over, exactly that. Here's a worse version of the thing.
And I think these are such great thoughts. And again, I'm coming back to my work on QAnon right now and how I see like QAnon kind of doing everything that you've all been talking about. So I'm really glad to have had this conversation today. And I want to thank you all for coming in. I think this is an indication that we could just keep going and have a lot more to talk about. So we might have to do another one on an aspect of this relationship sometime in the future, because I think that would be fantastic to keep the conversation going that way.
That would be great.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
As an independent scholar, I'm bereft of these conversations. So,
well, we definitely need to create more space for them. And maybe, I know for a different organization I work for, we are going to create a space for scholars to just talk with one another. So maybe we should do something similar there for this group as well. So I'll work on that. But thank you everyone for coming in today on April 15th. And I hope you all have a great rest of the week. And yeah, hopefully it's getting warm where you are. Somewhat, yeah. South Dakota, I'm like, you're going to be in a while.
I'm in Yorkshire. It's always cold here.
It's kind of like South Dakota then.
There you go.
All right, have a good one, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Nice
Great
to meet you all.
conversation.
Yeah, good to meet you.
you.